Right to the floor to the senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to appear tonight, and I share my praise for my colleague, the senator from Connecticut. We came to the Senate together, and his leadership on this issue is something I admire. But more than leadership on the issue, I admire his heart and his compassion, because he has suffered because his citizens have suffered. And if you suffer and you don't try to change things, you don't try to do things differently, then you're not fully alive. And so I just honor that in you, that you're willing to be vulnerable and in your suffering try to find help for others. I have a little scar tissue on this, Mr. President, and I'd love to just describe the Virginia experience and my own personal experience on this, and then ask a series of questions to my colleague from Connecticut. I was elected to office for the first time in May of 1994 to the Richmond City Council, and at the time I was elected, Richmond had the second highest homicide rate in the United States per capita. I was sworn in on July 1, 1994. In October of 1994, October 14th, I'll never forget that day, in my city council district, in a public housing community that is the largest between Washington and Atlanta, Gilpin Court, a 35-year-old guy walked into an apartment and gunned down a family of 6, from a 35-year-old woman to her younger sister to tiny little babies and children. And I got a call as a city council member, and I raced to the scene, and it was chaos, and that has begun a 22-year experience of being too intimate with this problem. That funeral of the family in the Arthur Ashe Center in Richmond, with 3,000 people in 6 little white coffins at the front of the room, is something that I will never, ever forget. A number of years later, I was governor of Virginia. I had just taken a trade mission to Japan and had landed, checked into the hotel, had fallen asleep, and someone knocked at my door. It was April 16, 2007. My security detail says, "You have to call home. Something horrible has happened in Virginia. It's still underway." And I called to find that a shooting was still then taking place at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg that eventually killed 32 people, injured dozens of others. At that point, the worst shooting incident in the history of the United States, but no longer. That was the worst day of my life, and it will always be the worst day of my life. Comforting the families of the victims, talking to the first responders who went into a classroom where bodies littered the floor and heard in the pockets of deceased students and professors cell phones ringing as parents who had seen it on the news were calling their kids, just knowing they're at Virginia Tech, to ask them if they would be all right, a call that would never be answered. This traumatized some of the most hardened first responders that I know. I knew priests and ministers in that community who had seen a lot and were traumatized in the days to follow. And to the senator from Connecticut, you have a reasonable proposal on the floor with respect to background record checks. The deranged young man who had committed that crime and then killed himself was not supposed to get a weapon. He was federally prohibited from getting a weapon because he'd have been adjudicated mentally ill and dangerous. But the weaknesses of the background check system, gaps in the background check system, had enabled him to purchase this weapon and commit this unspeakable carnage. We learned everything we could learn from that tragedy. We fixed what we could fix, but to my everlasting regret, I could fix part of the background record check system. But when I went to my legislature and said, let's have universal background checks so this won't happen again, even in the aftermath of the worst shooting tragedy in the history of the United States, I couldn't get my legislature to do the simple thing that the voters, that gun owners, that NRA members said they should do. And then a year ago, it was in August of 2015, in the same community, the Blacksburg-Roanoke community in Virginia, a young woman I know who was the TV reporter at WDBJ television, Allison Parker, who covered Senator Warner and me. We know her parents. She was shooting a live piece in the morning about an anniversary of a local chamber of commerce, and a mentally ill former employee of the station came up live on television and videoing himself and killed Allison and Adam Ward, her cameraman, and ultimately took his own life later that day. We got scar tissue in my town. We got scar tissue in my Commonwealth. We've got scar tissue in this country. We've got scar tissue personally. And after every one of these instances, we resolve to be better. We resolve to do more. Why do we need to be passive? Why do we need to do nothing? We resolve to do better and do more, and yet here in this body we can't. We were together here, my colleague from Connecticut. Now, I talked about the worst day of my life at Blacksburg, but the worst day in the Senate was standing here on the floor in April of 2013 and having a debate about this very piece of legislation about background record checks. And we were surrounded in the gallery by the victims and the families from Newtown. And they were watching us. There's a line in the letter to the Hebrews that talks about being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And we were surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And with them were Virginia Tech families. And they were together, and they were watching us, and they were praying, I know, for us that we would do the right thing. And yet, even with the family members who had suffered from your state, Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, even with those family members hoping we would do the right thing, we couldn't get there. And as surely as night follows day, there have been other tragedies, and now something I hoped would never happen, a shooting tragedy that eclipsed even this horrific tragedy in Blacksburg in 2007. And so the question that has to be asked is, what will it take and when will we act? And so if I could ask you a series of questions, because I'm not just grappling with this as a legislator, I'm grappling with this as a person, as a parent, as a friend, as somebody who's got the scar tissue that we all have. I have an organization in my state that's headquartered in my state, the National Rifle Association, that says we can't do anything because of the Second Amendment. And so let me ask you a couple of questions to my colleague. You would agree with me, would you not? The Second Amendment, it's in the Constitution, so of course it's important. It's important like the First Amendment is important. Wouldn't you agree with me on that?
It's in there for a reason, Senator Kaine.
It's in there for a reason, and it's been in there since 1787, and Virginians were drafters. So it's in there for a reason, and it's important, just like the First Amendment is important. Let me ask you about the First Amendment. The First Amendment says there is a right to free speech and a right to freedom of the press. Now, does that mean constitutionally that I can go out and slander and libel anyone and there is no consequence for that? Is that what the First Amendment means?
The First Amendment is as important as the Second Amendment, but it comes with conditions and responsibilities. One of them is that you can't slander your fellow citizens. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are important limitations since the beginning of the Republic built around the First Amendment, which frankly is as sacred as any of the individual rights that are encompassed in the Bill of Rights.
There's another part of the First Amendment that says that you have a right to assemble. Now, my understanding, and you're a lawyer, so you tell me if I'm wrong about the right to assemble, is you've got a right to assemble, but a government can condition that. It can say you've got to get a permit or you can assemble here, not there. It can't discriminate among points of view, but the common constitutional provision is that there can be reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner of assembly under the First Amendment, and that's completely constitutional. Is that your understanding of the clause?
It's yet another qualified right within the Bill of Rights.
And I could do the same thing on the Third Amendment, and I could do the same thing on the Fourth Amendment. I could do the same thing on the Sixth Amendment and on the Seventh Amendment, the right to trial by jury in civil matters. And in each of these rights, which are important, just like the Second Amendment is important, in each of these rights, we commonly accept, actually, we demand, not just accept, that consistent with the constitutional rights, there be reasonable limits so that we can live together in peaceable harmony as citizens. And would you agree with me that there's nothing about those reasonable restrictions in the First or the Second or the Third or the Fourth or the Sixth or the Seventh Amendments that is at all inconsistent with the constitutional framework